Yesterday's Torah reading tells us about the creation of the first Jewish family, Abraham and Sarah being remembered to have a son together, Isaac. And the Haftorah follows the same theme, and it invokes a memory of our people about a woman named Hannah, who comes to the holiest place in Judaism to pray, the Mishkan. And she comes to pray for a son, particularly a son, as the text will tell you, as the Talmud debates. And the high priest, Eli, sees her praying with her mouth moving and no sound being uttered, assumes that she's drunk, and tells her that drunken people should not be around the Mishkan, that she should go home and sober up. And she tells him that she's not drunk. She's praying for a child. She kind of reprimands him, corrects him, and he tells her that her prayer will be granted that year. Her prayer is in fact granted, and she gives birth to Samuel, who she then has to give back to serve at the tabernacle. Samuel grows up to replace the high priest's sons, who are, according to birthright, the rightful heirs to run the tabernacle, to run the family business. Samuel begins a new family business for the Jewish people. He anoints the first king, Saul, Shaul, who is, by the very nature of his name, Shaul, borrowed. And then, of course, he anoints David, by the nature of his name, he is God's beloved. That chapter about Hannah's prayer is described in the Talmud, in Masechet Brachot, pages, let's say 30b to 32a, as the paradigm for prayer for all Jewish people. And the question before us today is, why is that? What can we learn from the way in which Hannah davens? This is not a debate, although Victor Cohn will be scoring each of our comments here, point and counterpoint. The committee is Victor and Blair and Nina, so we'll just leave it to Victor to be impartial. And now I give it to my partner.
Good morning. Shana Tova. I want to tell you a story 5 times. It should only take about an hour. And then the rabbi, he has an hour. And then I have an hour. And then he has an hour. And for the 3 of you left in the room after that, we'll go have some lunch together.
Kol Nidre. It'll be time for Kol Nidre.
First time. Once upon a time, there was a wealthy landowner from the land of Ephraim, which is the middle north of the country, named Elkanah, who had 2 wives, Nebuch. The first one, Penina, had lots and lots of kids. The second one, Hannah, like many of our ancestors' moms, was infertile. They would come every year to the shrine at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was located, and offer their annual family sacrifice and sit down and have a meal with the priest. Sacrifice was not the destruction of an animal. It was, in fact, lunch. So you'd sit down and have a meal with the priest, and Penina would sit on one side with all of her kinderlach, the whole baseball team, and Hannah would sit on the other side all by herself weeping because every year she wanted to do her duty as wife and become a mother, and as a woman become a mother, and she wasn't able to do it. So one year, as the rabbi said, you'll find the story, by the way, in the Machzor on page 212. You can read it. One year, she gets up from the table in her pain and in her despair and in her desperation, goes into the shrine, prays, as it were, quietly. She is overseen by the priest, Eli, who thinks that she is drunk, she's intoxicated, castigates her, yells at her, chases her out of the Mishkan. She says no, and there's a wonderful play on words. I'm not drunk, I am pouring out my soul to God. The priest realizes his mistake. he sends her home with a blessing, and the next year she returns with a bouncing baby boy. It's a beautiful story. Part one. Here's a second telling of the story. We left Egypt with Moses, crossed the Red Sea, came to Mount Sinai, crossed the desert. Moses dies, Joshua conquers the land of Israel, and we settle in the land of Israel. For the next 200 years, we live in tribes, and there is no central government. And there is a quality of political and spiritual anarchy in the land. It's described in the book right before this one, which is called the Book of Judges in the Bible. Now, in truth, the Book of Judges is a beautifully crafted piece of political propaganda, trying to show you why we need a king. Because each of the judges of Israel, one after the other, is more unlikely than the last as a leader of the people Israel. And each time we lose our way both spiritually and politically. And the last line of the book of Judges says there was no king in Israel, and everyone did as he damn well pleased. And this is the first story after the book of Judges, and it's once again a story of the failure of leadership. Why do we need a king? Because we have priests who can't tell that a woman is brokenhearted and chases her out of the Mishkan. And we need someone to bring some order to this. Now, there's a secret to this Haftorah. There's a secret to this piece of literature. And I'll show you what it is, if you promise not to tell anybody, because it took me a long time to figure this out. Take a look at page 216 in the Machzor, right? Look at the first line. Vayhi lutkat hayamim. It so happened after such time, V'taher Chana, she gets pregnant, V'teled ben, and she has a kid, a boy, a son, V'tikra et shmo Shmuel, and she calls him Shmuel, Samuel. Ki me Adonai she'eltiv, because from God he was borrowed. Now wait a minute, Shmuel doesn't mean she'eltiv, those are two different words. She'iltiv means he was borrowed. The name that should be attached to that is Shaul, Saul. In fact, if you look at the last line of the long lines here on page 16, it says, right, Asher Haya Hu Shaul Adonai. This isn't Samuel's birth story. This is Saul's. This was a story about why we needed a king, and it was offered as a justification, the birth story of the first king of Israel. It just so happens that only the victors get to write the stories, so when David's guys got into power, when they came into the White House, they took all the documents and erased the name Saul, and they put in the name Samuel, because he was the guy that ordained David. And they basically ripped off his birth story, which is kind of pathetic when you think about it. But the second way to tell the story is that this is a story about the failure of leadership and the necessity for a new kind of leadership. Now we move ahead in history. In the year 70 of the Common Era, 70 CE, the Romans destroy the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. The rabbis who were trying to maintain Jewish life in the shadow of that Holocaust, of that destruction, have a problem. The temple was the core institution, and the worship at the temple, sacrifice was the way the Jews had worshipped since the very beginning. And the rabbis didn't have a temple anymore. They didn't have priests, no altar, no sacrifices. What do you do now? And the rabbis came up with this idea that instead of avodah ala mishkan, instead of avodah, sacrifice, we'll have avodah shebalev, prayer, verbal prayer. And they're looking for a paradigm. How do you teach verbal prayer? And they look through the entire corpus of the Tanakh. Now, people all over the Bible are praying, but only one person goes into the place of sacrifice, and instead of offers a sacrifice, they offer prayer. And not only do they offer prayer, but it works. God gives her a kid, and that's Hannah. And so she becomes the paradigm of prayer, because this is the only time in the entire Bible that someone offers a prayer and actually gets what they want, which proves that prayer works. And so they say, they take all the lessons. The line in the Gemara is Rabbi Eliezer, who says, how many things can we learn from Hannah, rather, in the Hannah? So, for example, they say, Hannah prayed from her heart. From here we learn that one who prays must direct their heart. And Hannah only moved her lips. And from here we learn that one who prays must enunciate with their lips. And Hannah's voice couldn't be heard. And from here we learn that it's important to articulate your prayer. So Hannah becomes the paradigm for a new form of worship that needed legitimacy. Because nobody ever did it before. Because the people of Israel asked the rabbis, we have no temple, no priest, no sacrifice. How are we going to come before God? And the rabbi's answer is, Hannah came before God and prayed. You can come before God and pray. And it didn't occur to them that it's kind of odd that she's a woman. And Rabbinic Judaism was so ferociously patriarchal that it suppressed the voices of women. In fact, there's actually a law which says that you're not allowed to allow a woman to sing in public. Sorry. Because of the effect that it might have on weak-minded men, which is redundant. Now, by the way, in Israel, this becomes a serious problem because they have a big Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration in Israel, and this year they wanted to allow a woman to sing the Hanukkah blessing, and they wouldn't let her. Kol Isha could make bad things happen. So it was a big argument in Israel over whether a woman can lead prayer, whether a woman can sing in public, whether she can sing a secular song even. Didn't bother the rabbis. Hannah becomes the paradigm for prayer. That's the third telling of the story. Here's the fourth telling of the story. You ready? Hannah's a protest. Hannah, something interesting happens to Hannah in the story. Let's take a look inside. Look at the Chumash. The Machzor, please. Right? Look on page 214. I'll be with you in just a second, Rabbi. Having too much fun here. Hannah rose to pray after eating and drinking. Page 215, top of the page. You see it? Everyone see it? She gets up to go pray. While Eli the priest was sitting on his seat at the entrance of the temple of the Lord. So she's down here praying. She throws herself on the ground to pray, and he's sitting up on his chair. Visually, he is up, and she is down. So he is literally looking down on her. Everybody get this image? With a heavy heart, she prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and she took a vow, saying, O Lord of hosts, if you look upon the plight of your servant and remember me not for when I have a kid, I'll give him to you, God. As she continued to pray before the Lord, Eli, up here, watched her lips, watched her mouth. What is he not doing? He's not hearing her. He's only watching her. From up here, he's looking down on her. For Hannah was speaking to herself. Her lips moved, her voice could not be heard. Eli thought she was drunk. And he said to her, how long will you go on with your drunkenness? Put away the wine from yourself. And Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I'm a troubled woman. In the Bible's telling of the story, she's obsequious and respectful, and it's a misunderstanding. But the rabbis weren't satisfied with that. The rabbis were bothered by this. And you find this all over the Talmudic tradition, that the Talmudic tradition encodes its own subversive voices. It's a problem with authority that doesn't recognize a broken heart. There's a problem with a religious authority who looks down on people and judges people. There's a problem with a religious authority that doesn't recognize someone whose heart is broken. Right? So look at, if you know a little bit of Hebrew, pardon me for this. You see where it says, "No, my Lord"? Everybody see that? In Hebrew, it's "Lo Adoni." Ishak shat ruach anochi. Lo Adoni means, what it says here, translate, "No, my Lord." But the rabbis reread that in a different way. They turn her around and they give her a voice. For the rabbi's construction of Hannah is that she's not obsequious. She's not subservient. She's not passive. She turns around to him and says, "Lo Adoni, you are not my master. You are not anyone's master." If a person can come into this place of God and pour out their heart to God, and all you can do is judge them and castigate them and exclude them and push them out, you don't belong as an authority in this place. And this is the rabbi's, it's the rabbi's self-castigation. Be careful, you who stand up here with big robes and big yarmulkes. Don't look down on people. Be careful, you don't know their hearts. They give Hannah a voice. And the voice is a voice of subversion, of revolution. That becomes part of prayer. So the question I'm going to ask the rabbi as soon as I'm finished in another half an hour or so is, how is prayer itself subversive? Because that midrash, that way of reading the text, is now encoded in our traditions of prayer. Prayer is itself a subversion of authority. If authority becomes officious, if authority becomes repulsive, if it rejects and excludes instead of embraces and includes. Fifth level, last one, quickly. What's this about? It's about a woman whose heart is broken, who brings that broken heart before God, and a religious structure that doesn't understand that only sees the behavior, the outward, and doesn't see what's inside. And after all, what is prayer? Prayer is the inside. In a certain way, prayer is the inside turned outward. What do we have to bring to God? In the old days, you brought a sheep. You brought a cow. You brought a basket of bread. Whether you had mixed motives or not, you brought something objective. You had an objective thing and you brought it as an act. The act was objective. It was behavioral. Now what do? We bring our hearts. Prayer is a very tricky thing because you bring your heart. I mean, in a certain way, it shouldn't work. It's like saying to my wife, honey, I love you so much. No object in the world could possibly contain my love for you, so I didn't buy you a birthday present. Just know that I love you. She's a very tolerant and beautiful soul, but that ain't going to work. This rabbi's going to be eating Chinese food, cold Chinese food for a week. That's what prayer is. We don't have a thing to bring to God anymore. What do we have? So the rabbis say the whole notion of prayer is based on the idea that there is something real about our subjectivity, that the inner life, the feeling, the sense of who we are. That's why this is here in Rosh Hashanah, not just the reason the rabbi articulated, which was very important, of course, the connection with the Torah reading, but the idea that we're going to come today, Rosh Hashanah, and then next week in Kippur, and we're going to bring what's in our hearts. That's all we can bring, is what's in our hearts. And that the rabbis are articulating here that, you know something? That's enough. To bring what's in the heart is actually quite a remarkable gift. I'll get you a birthday present, I promise you. But the thought does count. The feeling does count. The regret we have over the sins we committed, that does count. The intentions we muster to live a better life next year, that does count. And the sense we bring of love for people and for God, that does count. And here you have in the last reading of the text a sense of validation of the subjectivity of a human being who stands in worship before God. Those are 5 readings of the same text. Rabbi, why is subversion part of prayer?
Subversion is prayer. And we know this because all of the rabbis that we would name as inspiring rabbis have been subversive in their own right, speaking truth to power, justice to power, speaking about the times that are challenging for Jewish people. The rabbis in the Talmud ask, Mashal lema hadavar hazeh, to what is this analogous? And they say that Hannah, standing before Eli, the high priest, is analogous to a poor person showing up to a very wealthy party, walking in to see a feast after this poor person has not been able to eat for a long time. And the king looks at this poor person and says, you're not on the list. You don't have a seat. And the poor person says, the tables are full of food. Can you not spare even a parcel for me? The rabbis look at Hannah standing before God as the perfect recipe of subversion and kavanah and chutzpah, which are the three basic ingredients that we need for prayer. Ilana Kirshen, who wrote If All the Seas Were Ink, she teaches that Chana is, for the rabbis, iconic, courageous chutzpah before God. She has the ability to stand and say to God, you owe me more than what's happening in my life. And because of what she says and the way she says it, this foolish high priest thinks that she's drunk. But if she's drunk, the rabbis tell the Jewish people, we should be drunk like her. To be able to stand in this place and say to God, you owe the world more. You owe us more. Tammy Schneider, who's my advisor at Claremont Graduate University, wrote a book called Mothers of Promise. And in it, she develops this academic philosophy where she studies all of the women in the Torah. And she examines the psukim in which they are the subject and there are active verbs attached to them. And you know what? There are very few women in the Torah who have active verbs attached to them again and again and again and again. There are very few women who act and then act and then act before somebody can stop it. Sarah is barren. She doesn't pray to God, and Abraham doesn't pray for her. Abraham prays for himself. Rebecca is barren, and Isaac, the Shmendrik, the Fredo of the three forefathers, Fredo has the chutzpah to say to God, listen to her, listen to me, give her a child. Jacob, he's got so much service, he doesn't have time to pray for anything. He's got 4 wives, 1 million children. Have Rachmanis on this guy. But his wife, his favorite wife, she has to trade and like it's a shuk to get his attention and the right to have children. Chana is the first one in our tradition who stands before God and prays for herself. Not through an intermediary, not through a priest, not through a husband. She's the first one to stand before God and say, I really think this isn't right. If I had a child, it would be so good for the entire Jewish people. When you talk about subversion, you talk about the idea that the temple was a very formal place. The Mishkan was a very formal place. It was filled with rules of how we were supposed to worship. This isn't only a story about gender. This isn't only a story about who sits high and who stands low. It's a story of formality against sensitivity. It's a story of private practice in a space that's supposed to be devoted to public behavior. It's a space of ona'at dvarim, sufferings, versus yisurin shel ahava, the sufferings of a broken heart. What Chana brings us isn't only subversion. She brings us a sense that prayer works, and that not only that, we can think for ourselves. The author of Shmuel really thought that the Jewish people didn't know much about its background. And the reason we know that is because every single name in Shmuel, in the books of Samuel, tell you exactly who that person is. If I wrote a movie and I named the hero Hero, I would hope that you know that that's the hero of the movie. David is named David, and it is as simple as naming him hero. Shaul is named Shaul because you're supposed to understand that he's the wrong choice from the very outset. Hannah means the grace of God. She is the quality of grace. And so when people say the Jewish people are chutzpahdik, we have to be chutzpahdik because what we think as grace is a woman standing before the high priest and saying, "You're not my Lord, I'm not drunk, get out of my way." And since that moment, every Jewish mother has said that to somebody and followed in Hannah's tradition. She is married to Elkanah. Elkanah means jealous God. How could the grace of God be married to a jealous God, a judgy God, an unjust God? That's not what we believe in. We don't believe in a husband who looks at a wife with many children and a wife with no children and says to the wife with no children, "I still love you a lot, here's an extra dessert." That's not enough for the Jewish people. We look at that portrait and say, that's not for us. That's Elkanah. That's for some other worship. We look at Hannah and we say that that's for us. The way that Hannah behaves, that's the way we want our people to behave. The rabbis who silenced women in a way that the Bible never dared pointed to Hannah and said, this recipe of chutzpah and audacity and righteousness and grace, that's what's going to carry our people forward for generations to come. Would you like to conclude, or should we stand for Kol Nidre? The sugya ends in a very interesting way. Go ahead. I thought I was on my own. Herschel just offered to volunteer to join in this debate. Jack, this is open mic night at VBS. Anybody who has a take on Hannah, please come up right now.
Who was Hannah again?
That's right. V'shachat kohen, that's the question that the sugya really ends on. Did the priest actually shecht? That there's a story that the sugya tells us that Samuel, who doesn't grow up with the same honor for Eli, after all, there's no reason to believe that he'll ever be a high priest, that he'll ever be the high prophet. It's going to go to Elkanah, the jealous God's sons. Those are going to be the people who take over for him. And Samuel is the one that says we don't need a priest to shecht. And the response to that is, v'hikrivu hakohanim. Him saying that, finally, you can either read it as the priests actually made the offerings, or the priests actually finally came close to the people of Israel for the first time. Samuel, Hannah's tradition allows that to be possible.
Samuel is unusual in the Bible. He's a transitional figure. He's not a Kohen. His family comes from Ephraim, and yet he functions like a Kohen. He's not a prophet because he was never really called to be a prophet, but he talks to God all the time. He's not a king or a member of the royal family, but he ends up anointing kings and making kings kings. He's a very mercurial, strange character to be right in the middle. And the rabbis see him, and you can see why the rabbis would focus on him as an interesting character. Because it was clear at that moment that the old regime had gone away. We had conquered the land and settled the land and lived in the land as tribes, but it was time for something new. And we Jews have a hard time with time for something new. We like to do it the way we used to do it. We always like to do it the way we used to do it. And it's really, really hard for, the story of a guy who comes to a shul and he watches it after everyone's aliyah, they bow down, walk back 3 steps. And so he asks the guy in the shul, why do you do that? He says, it's a tradition. He says, yeah, but why is there a tradition? He says, I don't know. It's a tradition. Go ask Ziegelboom. He's been here since the beginning. So they go to Ziegelboom and they say, Ziegelboom, how come we bow down and take 3 steps back? He says, because in the old shul, there was a beam right here, and if you didn't bow down, you banged your head. We like to do things the way we've always done things. They have a hard time. The rabbis find themselves in the exact same position as Shmuel. The temple is gone. What do we do now? And they're looking for a model as a model for leadership and creativity and innovation that legitimizes that kind of imagination, that kind of spiritual creativity and religious imagination to reorganize a people around a new ideology that is rooted in the past but expressed in different media in the moment. And Shmuel is the perfect character because he's the son of Chana. He's the son of divine grace. And he's also the son of human chutzpah. And when you bring God's grace and her chutzpah together, you end up with the capacity to create new forms for this people and a new vision of what tomorrow might bring.
I'll just close with this last comment. The end of the Chana story is actually one of the introductions of David. So David has 3 introductions. One time, he's actually in the VBS chorus area, and they bring him out, and he plays the harps for Saul. That's one introduction. One introduction is the David and Goliath story. That's an introduction. The third introduction, and the best introduction, is Samuel meeting David for the first time, Hannah's son. So Hannah's son asks God, who am I supposed to appoint now that the first guy's a dud? And God says, go to Yishai's house. At Yishai's house, you'll meet his son, and he's worthy of being king over Israel. So he knocks on the door, and Yishai opens his door, and this tall, strapping guy comes up to the door, and Samuel looks at him and is very impressed, and he looks up to God, and he says, this is the one? And God says, no, that's not the one. So he says, do you have another son to Yishai? And Yishai says, yes, I actually do have another son. And the second oldest comes over, and the second oldest is a little bit shorter and a little bit overweight, but he could do. And he looks at him, and he says, God, is this the one? He says, no, this is not the one. And Yishai, he says, how many sons do you have? He says, I have 8 sons. So one by one, they come out, and each one a little bit more nebach than the one before, right? And every time Samuel looks at these people and says, is this the one, God? And God says, this is not the one, this is not the one. This is for 7 sons, he looks through this line. And the 8th son doesn't show up. And so Yishai says, my 8th, the runt of the litter, we keep him out back with the sheep. We don't even let him in the house. This is the one you want to see? So they bring him in the back, and the Torah describes him, the Tanakh describes him as a ruddy little kid. Red. And Samuel looks at God and said, this is the one that's going to be king of Israel? And God says something to Samuel, to Hannah's son, that it's as if Hannah was finally speaking to Samuel, her son. The answer to this story, the cap on the story, comes in this moment when God says to Samuel, I don't see people like people see people. And Samuel looks down at the same kid, and he sees the kingship living inside this little kid for the first time. I don't see people like people see people. That's at the heart of what we're praying for most of the holidays, is for God to see us differently than the way that we see each other. See the best of me. Don't see the worst of me. Don't only talk about my flaws. Talk about the blessings that I bring to the world. See my potential. And so in this Hannah narrative, we read the Haftorah in the beginning of the narrative because we can't read all 12 chapters of Samuel that lead up to that story, because it might be as long as this conversation that we're having right now, and nobody would like that. But it ends with God telling all of us through Samuel not to worry when you look in the mirror. That's not what I see. And when I judge you, it's not going to be according to some kind of human rubric. I'll judge you according to the best in you. And that's the grace of God. That's Chana.